Welcome to Mrs. Feighery's video number 2 for Chapter 35, America in World War II. The armed forces had nearly 15 million men and 216,000 women, and some of these women in arms included the WACS, called the WACS, Women's Army Corps, the WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, and the SPARS, U.S. Coast Guard's Women's Reserve. Because of the national draft that plucked men and women from their homes and into the military, there weren't enough workers to go around. Even with a workforce this size, the draft left farmers and factories needing help. In 1942, the Bracero Program was an agreement with Mexico which brought thousands of Mexican agricultural workers, called braceros, across the border to harvest fruit and grain crops in the West. The Bracero Program brought Mexican workers to America as resident workers. With the men in the military, over 6 million women took up jobs in the workplace, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, seen in this propaganda poster here. And upon war's end, many did not return to their homes as in World War I. Rosie the Riveter was performing tasks from drilling the fuselage of heavy bombers to joining the links for tank tracks. This female revolution into the workforce is not as great as commonly exaggerated, though. At the end of the war, 2/3 of the women did end up returning home. The immediate post-war period saw people rushing to the suburbs and a huge baby boom, which produced tens of millions of new babies between 1945 and 1960, and those are called the baby boomers. This is a picture of 2 women that were working as war workers. More than 6 million women, and more than 3 million of them originally homemakers who had never before worked for wages, entered the workforce during World War II. In contrast to the experience of women workers in World War I, many of these newly employed women continued as wage workers after the war ended. The war also forced many people to move to new places, and many young folks went to and saw new cities far from home. There was massive wartime migrations as a result. FDR used the war as an excuse to pump lots of money into the stagnant South to revitalize it, helping to start the blossoming of what was called the Sun Belt. Still, 1.6 million blacks left the South for better places, and explosive tensions developed over black housing, employment, and segregation facilities. Philip Randolph, leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened a Negro march to Washington in 1941 to get better rights and better treatment. Roosevelt, at the same time as the march was threatened, issued an executive order banning all discrimination in the defense industries. He then established the Fair Employment Practices Commission to monitor compliance and discourage racism and oppression in the workplace. Blacks in the Army still suffered degrading discrimination, for example, separate blood banks, but they still used the war as a rallying cry against dictators abroad and racism at home, overall gaining power and strength for their movement. Membership to the NAACP passed the 500,000 mark, and a new organization called the Congress of Racial Equality was founded in 1942. In 1944, the mechanical cotton picker made the need for muscle non-existent, so blacks that needed to pick cotton from the South could now leave since they were no longer needed. Blacks headed north in one of the greatest migrations in American history. Native Americans also left their reservations during the war, finding work in the cities or joining the Army. Some 25,000 Native Americans were in the Army, and the Navajos and Comanches were code talkers, relaying military orders in their own Native American languages, a code that was never broken by the Axis powers. Such sudden rubbing of the races did spark riots and cause tension, such as the 1943 attack on some Mexican-American Navy men in Los Angeles and the Detroit race riot, which occurred in the same year, that killed 25 blacks and 9 whites. This is a poster that shows "Let John Henry Go." This was actually an image from the cover of the National Urban League's publication, titled Opportunity, and it reflects the rising militancy of African Americans in the World War II era. This militancy helped energize the civil rights movement in the post-war years. This was a map of internal migration in the United States during World War II. Few events in American history have moved the American people about so massively as World War II. The West and the South boomed, and several war industry cities grew explosively. A majority of migrants from the South were blacks. 1.6 million African Americans left the region in the 1940s. This source is from the United States Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we can talk about this in class in more depth. But basically what it's showing is the average population increase of fast-growing cities from 1940 to 1950. And you can see the migration trends as evidenced by the arrows in different areas of the north, south, and western parts of the United States. America was the only country to emerge after the war relatively unscathed, and in fact it was much better off after the war than even before. The gross national product more than doubled, as did corporate profits. In fact, when the war ended and price controls were lifted, inflation shot up. So despite all of the New Deal programs, it was the plethora of spending during World War II that lifted America from its Great Depression. World War II was an extremely expensive war. The bill amounted to over $330 billion, which was 10 times the direct cost of World War I and twice as much as all previous federal spending since 1776. The income tax was expanded to help pay, and the remainder was borrowed. The national debt went from roughly $49 billion in 1941 to $259 billion in 1945, which can be shown here in the graph. The war had a cost of as much as $10 million per hour at one point. And we'll discuss more about the impact on the social fabric of the United States and mobilization of the workforce in class. This is the works cited page. The images used in this presentation are all taken from the public domain.